supposed to be an ordinary evening, a quiet road, a few passing cars, and the distant hum of a sleepy town settling in for the night. But then, something unexpected happened. Something terrifying. A gorilla. A massive, powerful gorilla. Standing motionless beside a lone car, refusing to move. Anyone who got too close was met with a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spine. Drivers slowed down, unsure of what they were seeing. Headlights illuminated the beast's muscular frame, its dark eyes staring ahead with an eerie, unshakable focus. Some people tried honking, yelling. Nothing worked. The gorilla stood firm, unmoving. Then a loud screech of tires. A car swerved violently to avoid the scene, narrowly missing the animal. People gasped. What was going on? Why was this giant creature refusing to leave? Distorted 911 call plays. Hello? Yes, there's a gorilla standing in the middle of the road next to a car. I don't know what it's doing, but it won't let anyone near. Someone needs to come quick. Police radio chatter crackles in. Dispatch. We've got multiple reports coming in about a large primate near a vehicle on Route 7. Units are en route. Possible animal escape from the local sanctuary. Proceed with caution. Word spread fast. A crowd gathered at a safe distance, watching in hushed confusion. Some whispered theories. Had the gorilla escaped from somewhere? Was it injured? Why was it standing so protectively next to that car? Minutes passed, then an hour. The gorilla still wouldn't move, but something was strange about the car. The windows were fogged, obscuring whatever was inside, and that's when the police arrived. Officers stepped out, assessing the situation carefully. No sudden movements, no loud noises. They knew one wrong move could send the animal into a frenzy. But when one officer got just close enough to peer inside the vehicle, he immediately froze. His face went pale. Then, as he stepped back, his hands trembled. And that's when the tears started to fall. The tension in the air was thick. More cars began to slow down, their drivers staring in disbelief at the surreal sight before them. A massive gorilla, towering over a parked car, its broad chest rising and falling steadily, its dark eyes fixed on something unseen inside. No one dared to get too close. The few who attempted it quickly backed away as the beast let out a low, menacing growl, a clear warning that it wasn't going to let anyone near. Whispers filled the air as bystanders tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Some thought it had escaped from a nearby zoo or sanctuary, but no reports of a missing gorilla had been made. Others speculated that it had wandered in from the wild, though that seemed nearly impossible. But one thing was clear. It wasn't acting aggressively without reason. It wasn't charging at people. It wasn't running away. It was protecting something. A small crowd began to form at a distance, murmuring among themselves. A local gas station worker stepped forward, speaking in a hushed but urgent voice. "I saw it earlier," he said, pointing at the gorilla. "It was already here when I finished my shift. It hasn't moved from that spot since." A woman chimed in, her voice shaky. "I was driving past when I noticed the car. I thought someone might have broken down, but then I saw it standing there, and I didn't know what to do." Others nodded in agreement. Everyone had the same question. What was inside that car? The more they stared, the more unsettling the situation became. The vehicle's windows were fogged up, obscuring any view inside. The engine was off. No signs of movement. If someone was inside, they weren't making any noise. That eerie stillness sent chills through those watching. Was someone in trouble? Hurt? Worse? Then, the wail of sirens pierced the air. Police vehicles approached cautiously, their flashing lights casting eerie red and blue reflections on the pavement. Officers stepped out slowly, scanning the situation. One of them reached for his radio, speaking in a low but firm tone. "We've got a large primate, possible escapee, guarding a vehicle. No visible threats, but we need animal control on standby." The others nodded and began forming a loose perimeter, keeping civilians back. Whatever was happening here, it was no ordinary animal sighting. One officer took a few steps forward, his hand hovering near his holster, not as a threat, but as a precaution. He called out gently, hoping to gauge the gorilla's reaction. No response. The creature didn't flinch, didn't turn its head. It just stood there, waiting, guarding. Then, in the thick silence, something shifted. One officer, carefully inching closer, finally reached a point where he could peek through the misted-over window. He squinted, trying to make out what was inside. And then, his breath caught in his throat. His entire body went rigid, his face drained of color. Slowly he stepped back, shaking his head slightly. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Another officer saw his reaction and moved forward. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and leaned in to look inside himself. Within seconds, his expression changed. Shock, disbelief, and then sorrow. His eyes welled up. Whatever they had just seen inside that car, it wasn't what anyone had expected, and it was enough to make a police officer cry. A heavy silence settled over the scene. The officers who had looked inside the car stood frozen, their expressions a mix of shock and sorrow. One of them wiped at his eyes, his breath shaky. The others exchanged glances, their faces pale under the flashing red and blue lights. Something was terribly wrong. The gorilla, still unmoving, let out a low, rumbling breath. It wasn't threatening, but it was firm, almost as if it knew the officers had seen what it had been protecting. The crowd, now growing restless, tried to inch closer, desperate to understand what was happening, but the officers quickly motioned for them to stay back. "What's inside?" someone called out. "Is it a person?" But no one answered. The officers weren't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Another officer approached cautiously, flashlight in hand. He stopped just short of the gorilla's reach, lowering his voice as he spoke into his radio. "We need paramedics here now. Possible?" He hesitated, his throat tightening. Possible unconscious individual inside the vehicle. The words barely made it out, and as soon as they did, a deep sense of urgency spread through the responding units. The mist on the windows was starting to clear in small patches, revealing faint outlines within the car. The officer with the flashlight angled the beam carefully, trying to avoid startling the gorilla. And then, there it was, a small hand, still, motionless, pressed against the glass from the inside. A ripple of emotion swept through the officers. It was a child. The realization hit hard. The gorilla hadn't been blocking the car out of aggression. It had been protecting someone, keeping them safe, shielding them from the outside world, refusing to move until help had arrived. And now, the officers knew they had to act fast. The ranking officer took a deep breath, motioning for his team to get into position. They couldn't afford to scare the gorilla. They needed to find a way to get to the child safely. Every second mattered. But just as they were preparing to move in, the gorilla did something no one expected. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head. For the first time, it made direct eye contact with the officers. Its dark, intelligent eyes seemed to hold something unspoken. A plea. A message. And then, just as slowly, it stepped back. One step, then another. Its powerful arms lowered slightly, no longer tense, no longer blocking the way. It was letting them in. The child was rushed into the ambulance, his small chest rising and falling with weak but steady breaths. The paramedics worked quickly, monitoring his vital signs, their hands moving with urgency. Every second counted. But as they secured him onto the stretcher, the real question remained. How had he survived this long? Alone, unprotected, in the cold. Except, he hadn't been alone. The officers turned their attention back to the gorilla, who remained still, watching everything unfold. It didn't try to run. It didn't show any signs of aggression. It simply observed, as if making sure the child was truly safe before it let go completely. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air once more, this time bringing hope instead of fear. The paramedics rushed in, carefully lifting the boy onto a stretcher. Oxygen was placed over his small face, a blanket wrapped tightly around his frail body. As they worked, one of them looked up at the officers, her expression one of pure astonishment. "How long was he in there?" she asked. "And how did he survive alone?" The answer stood just a few feet away, watching, waiting. The answer had never left his side. Days passed, but the mystery of that night refused to fade. The child, now safe in the hospital, had regained consciousness. Doctors marveled at his condition, dehydrated, weak, but miraculously unharmed. Against all odds, he had survived. But the question still lingered. How? Authorities worked tirelessly to piece together the truth. Who had left him there? Why? The note provided little to go on, and with no immediate leads, the case became even more heartbreaking. But as investigators searched for answers, the world had already latched onto one undeniable fact. He had been protected by something extraordinary. News of the gorilla's actions spread like wildfire. The footage from that night, blurry videos, frantic 911 calls, stunned witness accounts, captivated millions. Experts weighed in, astonished by the animal's behavior. Gorillas are highly intelligent and deeply emotional creatures, one primatologist explained in an interview. They form bonds. They protect those they see as vulnerable. What we witnessed here is nothing short of remarkable. But despite the global fascination, one question remained unanswered. Where had the gorilla come from? No local zoos or wildlife reserves had reported an escape. No one had come forward claiming to have raised it. It was as if this guardian had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as suddenly. Some called it a miracle. Others saw it as fate. But for the officers who had stood there that night, who had felt the weight of its presence, there was no doubt. This was no ordinary encounter. This was something else entirely. As for the child, his future remained uncertain. Without any family stepping forward, social services took over his care, determined to find him a safe home. But one thing was clear. He was here today because of an act of pure, selfless protection. A force of nature had stepped in when no one else could. And in a world so often filled with cruelty and indifference, one enormous, unexpected guardian had chosen to stand watch. To this day, no one knows where the gorilla went. It was never seen again. But those who were there that night, they'll never forget. And neither will we. The story of the gorilla and the child became more than just a local incident. It became a legend. News channels, social media, and wildlife experts all tried to explain what had happened that night. But no theory could fully capture the raw, unexplainable power of what had unfolded. People around the world were moved by the idea that a creature of such strength had chosen to protect rather than harm, to guard rather than attack. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the gorilla had once belonged to a private owner, escaping only to find itself drawn to the abandoned child. Others wondered if it had been part of a lost troop, separated and wandering until fate led it to that roadside car. But the truth? The truth remained as elusive as the gorilla itself. No trace of it was ever found. Not in the forests, not near the highways, not anywhere. Despite search efforts by authorities and wildlife organizations, it was as if the guardian had simply disappeared. Some officers believed it had gone back to the wild, returning to wherever it had come from. Others whispered the idea that maybe, just maybe, its purpose had been fulfilled. But the one person who might have held the answer was the boy himself. Though young and still recovering from the ordeal, the child was finally able to speak about that night. And what he said left everyone speechless. In a soft, quiet voice, he described waking up in the car, alone and afraid, crying out for his mother. But before the fear could consume him, something appeared outside the window. A shadow, a shape. Two large, dark eyes filled with something he hadn't expected. Kindness. The gorilla hadn't scared him. It had simply been there, watching over him, protecting him. And then, as exhaustion took hold, he had drifted back into sleep, never truly alone. His words sent chills through those who listened. Was it possible that this powerful animal had sensed his fear? That it had chosen to stay, not out of instinct, but out of something deeper, something almost human? In the end, the mystery of the gorilla's appearance, its actions, and its disappearance would remain just that, a mystery, a question without an answer. A moment in time that defied logic, but spoke to something greater. And maybe that's why the story stayed with so many. Because in a world where we often fear the unknown, where nature is seen as wild and untamed, this gorilla had shown something unexpected: compassion. A quiet, undeniable reminder that sometimes the most powerful protectors come from the places we least expect. So the next time you hear rustling in the trees, or catch a glimpse of something in the shadows, remember this story, because maybe, just maybe, that guardian is still out there, watching, waiting, protecting, just as it did that night.